everybody. Welcome back to Alan Wall's Photography. I'm Alan. Today we're going to be talking about photographing aeroplanes and other things that fly, but not birds. So when I was a young lad, I always wanted to be a pilot. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know how you became a pilot, but I just always thought that would be the very coolest job in the world, to fly aeroplanes for a living. And I didn't do that. I ended up going into a very, very different field entirely. But I think I always had this bug about wanting to fly and wanting to learn how to fly. Because when I was in my early 40s, I decided I was going to go ahead and learn how to fly. And I did. I took all the courses and everything and learned how to fly an aeroplane and soloed. And I'd go off on the weekends and zip around I wouldn't go very far because my plane was just an ultralight and it didn't hold a lot of petrol and it only had a small engine, but it was the flying part that I liked. I'd fly locally and land in fields and just explore, and it was great fun until I almost killed myself. And then I never went back up in the thing again because I clearly didn't know everything I needed to know, and I didn't know what I didn't know. So I stopped flying. But my love affair with aeroplanes has continued since. I find them endlessly fascinating, and one of the most beautiful man-made objects there is a nice, well-built aeroplane, and I hope they're all pretty well built. So what I love to do when I have some downtime and the weather's pretty like it is now is go out and find aeroplanes to shoot. And there are all kinds of places you can find them. Almost every decent sized town's got some kind of an aerospace museum, some hangar where they keep old planes. Some places are lucky enough to have like an aeroplane graveyard. Not that I know how you get access to one of those, but there are lots of old planes there that you can photograph. Most big airports have an air museum, and I think most Air Force bases do as well. There's one not far from where I live, and they have an incredible museum where you can go and photograph airplanes indoors or out. Probably the best place to go, though, the absolute best place to shoot airplanes is at an air show, whether that's a military air show or a civilian one. It takes some planning, but that's usually going to be the opportunity you're going to have to see planes close up and really get a good close look at them, as well as seeing them in flight. Unfortunately, air shows around here aren't that frequent. Like I say, we have a couple of really big ones. One nationally well-known one. But there are like a zillion people go to it, and there's really not an opportunity to get up really close with the aeroplanes. You get to shoot lots of nice pictures of them flying, but I thought what we'd mostly talk about today is the kind of aeroplane shooting that I do. There are really three types of aeroplane photography. The first I have never done and have always wanted to. And if you're a pilot, this is a request for you to take me to do this kind of photography. I don't have access to an airplane, like I said, but the first type is air-to-air photography. That's where you get in an airplane and you fly with other airplanes. Well, you don't fly. The man with the rudder flies, or the stick, or both. What you do is sit in the back and photograph the other planes. Now, that is something I have always wanted to do. No access to it. Don't know anybody who does that kind of thing, so I'll probably never get to do it. The other kind, or one of the other two kinds of photography, is shooting airplanes on the ground. And we've talked about that. That's where you'll need to go to museums, or if you have a small airport that they're willing to give you access to, you can get out on the apron. I'll be showing you some pictures of stuff I've done at our local airport. But what we're mostly going to be talking about, especially when it comes to the technical part, is how to shoot aeroplanes that are flying. And that's called air to ground. I don't know why, no, ground to air. All of these types of photography, air to air, ground to air, and ground to ground, they all sound like types of missiles, don't they? But that's not the kind of shooting we're doing. Anyhow, I've got some gear here, and I thought I'd walk you through what I use and show you how to set up the camera and tell you the important stuff you need to know. First of all, on the ground to ground stuff, if you're lucky enough to be in a situation where you have access to a great plane to photograph, you want to really treat that like you would any portrait of a person or even a landscape. You want to set your time right. You want to do this kind of photography in the morning or in the evening when the lights dramatic if possible. Weather is incredibly useful to augment the photograph. If you've got heavy ponderous clouds or a clear blue sky even. So plan it as if you would any portrait. And usually if you're on the ground and the plane's on the ground, you can get some very interesting, creative images using fairly wide angle lenses. But certainly a standard zoom like the one you're looking at me through, a 24 to 70 millimeter Nikon is what I would use for that kind of photography on the ground. It gives me quite a range, and you can get all of the effects that you'd want. It's much the same as shooting cars. If you've ever done any car photography, it's the same kind of thoughts. It's always nice to shoot from a low angle when you're shooting things like aeroplanes and cars for that matter. It makes them seem more imposing than if you shoot them from eye level. So it's a good idea to get as low as you can for some of those shots. If you have the assistance that you would need and the patience to do it and the access long enough to spend shooting a plane, another technique that you can use is the same kind of thing we do when we're shooting real estate. You can take multiple exposures using 1 or 2 speed lights is all you would need to illuminate parts of the plane. And then you can bring all that together in Photoshop as a composite. It's time consuming, but you can get some really very, very dramatic effects if you use that kind of pinpoint lighting and multiple exposures. I favor a full frame camera when I'm shooting planes that are on the ground. When I'm on the ground, I like having the extra pixels. I mean, fine either way, shooting ground to air with an APS-C or a micro 4/3 or a full frame. It doesn't matter. So camera, pretty much any DSLR or mirrorless camera will work. What you want it to have is a good fast burst speed. And these days, even the cheapest DSLRs usually have plenty of burst speed, because oftentimes you're going to be tracking an aeroplane and shooting it in flight when it's moving pretty fast in front of you. Another thing is you need a camera that has good autofocus. By that, I mean an autofocus that is quick and doesn't hunt around for focus, but gets right on it. The new Sonys certainly have astonishing autofocus, as do Canons and Nikons. Really, you'll know what I'm talking about. If you're a DSLR shooter, you'll know whether or not your camera's autofocus is up to the job. Another thing about autofocus is you have to make sure that your camera can be enabled to use back button focus. We'll talk a bit more about that later on, but no, we'll talk about it now, actually. Back button focus is a way that you can reassign your camera's focus from a half press of the shutter button, which is the way you would normally focus on a DSLR. You can assign that function to one of the buttons on the back. On some of the new cameras, you could assign it to your car key probably, but most commonly on DSLRs, it's this AF button on the back. AFLAEL. It's the auto exposure and autofocus lock. But you can turn this off for the function it's meant for, and you can reassign it to the half press to focus. When you're trying to shoot planes and you're constantly changing settings, but you have one thumb free all the time to engage or disengage focus, massively helpful. So if you don't know about that, if you want me to do a video on back button focus, I will. It's dead easy to set up. Just go in your manual and it'll be under back button focus, because every camera, I believe, has that now. Let me see, if you're lucky enough to have a camera that has IBIS, in-body image stabilization, that would be very, very handy, especially if you're ever lucky enough to get to shoot air to air from an aeroplane that's vibrating. That would be a very helpful thing to have. So let's talk for a minute about lenses, because this stuff's important. It's way more important than the camera that you have. All of the things that I listed that you need on your camera, I think, are pretty much standard on even the most entry-level DSLRs, and I know that all mirrorless cameras have that technology built in. The lenses, however, is what's going to make or break your aeroplane shooting outing. There is a happy medium that you need to find between how much reach your lens is going to give you and how much harder it is to shoot with a long lens. Now, years ago when I started shooting planes, I thought that the safest bet would be to get a longer zoom, obviously, so that I could get images from further away. And for a long time, this was the lens that I usually carried with me. And there are several reasons why this is probably not a good idea and not something I would recommend. This is, by the way, the Tamron 150 to 600. It's the newer edition of their two sport zoom lenses. And it's got a reach of 600 millimeters, so it gets you really close. But it's heavy. It's not as heavy as a prime lens, a 400 millimeter prime lens, but it's heavy enough to where on a full frame camera, you wouldn't want to be lugging this around all day at the air show. The problem is, because it is so long and so heavy, even though it's got one of the best vibration control technologies of any lens that's made, as far as I'm concerned, it's still hard to get really, really sharp images with this. I think the maximum aperture on this thing's f5, and it goes up to f6.3 when you're all the way zoomed. So yeah, it doesn't let a whole lot of light in, and it doesn't really work great for this kind of photography. I've used it. I'll show you some pictures here that I've captured with this. It's not a bad option. It's just not the best option, in my opinion. And one of the things that you don't think about is, when you're looking at your lens, is that some of the very, very best photographs that you're going to get are when the aircraft makes a close pass, either flies in front of you or during an air show comes screeching over the top of your head. These things can give you problems getting a shot, because the when the plane's close, it fills most of your sensor. So I would steer clear of this, though if you've got one that you use for wildlife or whatever, then certainly give it a shot. Now, about the right range I think you should be looking in is somewhere around 200 to 300, maybe 400 millimeters, and something that is light and has very fast autofocus. It's also nice if it has quiet autofocus, because it's going to be focusing a lot. Now, I bought this is a crop frame camera. This is a Nikon D7500, which is one of my backup cameras. I'm shooting this video with my full frame D850. This lens is the AFS Nikkor 70 to 300. It's an inexpensive lens. It's a like a $500 lens, and I don't like the autofocus on it. It's got a silent wave motor in it. I have no idea what that means, but it definitely doesn't mean silent. It's noisy as can be. And it seems to have a hard time making up its mind on focus. But the concept here is a good one. This idea of 70 to 300, it's actually 70 to 300 on a full frame camera. On this camera with the crop sensor, it's actually, it's got a length of 450 millimeters, 450. So you can really get in pretty tight with this. And it has Nikon's second generation VR, which is enormously helpful. Whatever lens you end up getting, pick something that has vibration control or vibration reduction in it, because you're going to need it if you're hand holding, and you're going to be hand holding. We'll be talking about tripods in just a second. So this isn't what I use, but it is a very good alternative if you're trying to stay on the budget side. It's very versatile. It'll work on your DX or your full frame cameras without any difficulty. And it's light. It's really light and easy to spend the day lugging around. And every lens maker has their version of this, something in the 70 to 300 spread on a zoom. So find one that's got a good reputation, and you'll have it made. This is the lens I actually use, and this is probably my favorite lens in my bag. It's the Tamron 70 to 200, the VC. It's the newer version, the G2 version, the one with the silver on it, not the gold one. This is the sharpest lens that I own. It has a spectacularly fast and quiet autofocus, and the best vibration control of any lens I've ever used. So I don't go anywhere without this lens, and for shooting flying aeroplanes, this is my choice. If I want more reach, I can put this on a crop frame camera and get, close to 400 millimeters out of it. But the 70 to 200 G2. Now, whichever lens you get and whichever camera you're using, both of those things are less important than where you put your body. That's the single most important thing that I would recommend you spend time planning. And that is, when you're going to go somewhere to shoot aeroplanes, think about the weather, the lighting, where the sun is going to be during your shooting, how to get the best possible angle for your shots. I live in a very, very flat place, and there aren't very many vantage points, but there are a couple of small airports around here that do have slightly elevated areas. And if you're nice and persistent and willing to bribe, you can get access to some of these viewing areas at airports and set up your gear on the crest of a knoll and shoot all day long. For air shows, it's a little bit harder unless you're lucky enough to be in a hotel that's got some elevation, or if there's a hill nearby that's not too far distant. It's hard to get into higher structures when there's an air show going on, but if you can make use of it, it's still fun to shoot from absolutely ground level. And I'm going to show you a few examples in a minute of how you can get photographs that really look like they were air-to-air photographs when I'm standing on the ground and the plane is flying by. It all depends on the angle of the plane, but planning where you're going to stand is so important. Or you can spend hours just wasting time, because if you're constantly shooting into the sun, and you're just going to get a lot of aeroplane silhouettes, and it's frustrating. So plan those in advance. And if you're going to a place you've never been before, there's a thingy, an app on my phone that I got ages ago called Plan It for photographers. It's I can't remember if it cost anything or if it was free, but it's a great way to look at a map of the area, the airport, and see where the sun's going to be and what time it comes up and so on. Great planning tool. All right. So I think we've covered pretty much all the basics. Now, the question is, how do we set up our camera to shoot aeroplanes? Because these are relatively, usually, but not always, small, fast moving, brightly colored objects with a bland blue or white background, the sky. So what's the best way to set up the camera? Well, it largely depends on what kind of airplane you're shooting. Jets, which often will make up the bulk of the air show type of aeroplanes you'll see, at least the military ones, these things are flying stupidly fast, and they're tiny and very exhilarating. If you get a chance to go to one of those, it's the best fun. But when you're shooting jets, I usually recommend, if your camera will allow you to do it, set it up in Aperture Priority. Set the camera to usually f5.6 or f8. That's usually about right. And leave it there in Aperture Priority so that the camera will just decide what kind of shutter speed you need. It's one of the very, very few times, in fact, it might be the only time that I use a setting other than manual. But it's nice when planes are coming at you from all different angles to be able to just set it and forget it and leave it on Aperture Priority and let the camera set your shutter speed for each shot. Also, whether you're shooting jets or propeller aeroplanes or even helicopters, set your shutter release continuous high. That will shoot at that rate until your buffer fills, and that's why I'm saying make sure that your camera has the ability to shoot bursts. I think they all do anyway. So that's for jets. But what about propeller aeroplanes? This is a different matter and an interesting one. If you shoot that the using the jet settings on a prop, you'll get sharp pictures for sure, because you're on a bright day like today, your shutter speed will probably be at 1/2000th, because it's nice and bright. And if you were setting the thing on f8, but the problem is with propeller aeroplanes, if you use those settings, what you end up with is photographs of a plane that looks like it is suspended in space with a propeller that is stopped. It looks very unnatural. And it's disappointing because I've shot a lot of, back in the early days, I shot lots and lots of what I thought were really cool propeller aeroplane photographs, only to find that all of my propellers were stock still. It really does look like a model that you've got hanging from the ceiling or on a stick. So it's very important that you set your shutter speed slow enough to capture the blur of the propeller. What you ideally want to get is a disk of blurriness so that you can see it. It just looks more dynamic. But of course, to get that, you have to be shooting at a shutter speed somewhere between 1/30th of a second and 1/100th of a second, which is not very fast. And it is certainly fast enough for you to introduce all kind of shake into the picture and blurring of parts of the plane you don't want to blur. So it's trial and error. It depends on the airplane. Some airplanes have very, very fast propellers. And they're much harder to freeze the propeller, but they're much easier to get that blur. And then there are others like the crop dusters that I'll be showing you in a minute, have much slower propellers, at least one of them does. And that's very hard to get to blur the propeller without blurring the plane. So that's what I would recommend, is use shutter priority when you're shooting propellers. Set your shutter speed somewhere between maybe 1/50th, just to see 1/60th to see what happens. And if you're not getting enough propeller blur, back it off a little bit. If you are and you've got room to speed it up, then do so. But somewhere in that range, 1/30th to 1/100th, and then put it in shutter priority so that the camera will select your aperture for you. One other thing that's worth thinking about, I do this as well. I use matrix metering on your camera, whatever your camera's version of that is, that gives you an overall reading on the light. And then try to underexpose your photographs just a little bit. I usually underexpose by about half a stop, 2/3 of a stop actually. And that tends to bring out a little bit more vibrancy in the colors of the airplane and the sky too. So underexpose just a little bit. So when it comes to autofocus, set your camera to autofocus continuous. In a Nikon, that's AF-C. You can do that either through the menu on the back of the camera, or you can use the focus control button, this little round thing with a switch. So you set it to AF auto. In fact, on Nikons, it's auto manual, and then press the round button in the center, and that will allow you to toggle back and forth with the rear dial to set your mode. And I recommend setting it to AFC with either a single point or a group mode. Group mode works like a bigger focal target. It's actually a bunch of different focus points that are sharing the responsibility for finding the focus point. If you're using AFC in group mode, it will usually lock on to the closest object to you in your field of view, which for this kind of shooting is actually pretty good, especially if you're using a nice deep depth of field with an f stop of around 8 or thereabouts. So that's one way to do it. The other way is to just shoot in AFCS, which is a single point, or in a group of 9 points, or whatever you're comfortable with when you shoot, say, wildlife, flying birds. There's one technique that you really have to learn, and you can learn this just by going out on the street and practicing it, and that is following or panning with your camera. Now, what that means is you have your camera and all of your settings are set up and you're using back button focus, and an aeroplane is coming by, or for the practice, we'll say a car, because that moves just in those two dimensions. Yeah, not a flying car, just a driving car. So what you would do would be, with the back button focus, you would acquire the car and you'd press the focus button. And then as the car moves by, you would, oh, I turned it off. Forgive me, it's been a long day. So you would focus on the car, and then as it goes by, like so. So you would shoot continuously while maintaining focus on the car. Now, what that does is it keeps the car in perfect focus and nice and sharp, but everything other than the car is blurred. You get the motion blur from the camera. So it creates a very real sense of movement in your subject. So there's one other thing that I didn't mention, but I'm going to mention. If you feel the urge to take a tripod with you to an air show or to go photograph airplanes, don't bother. Save yourself the hassle. When I was shooting with this, because with this, when I'm shooting birds, say, I will often use a tripod with a gimbal attached to the top of the tripod. You know what a gimbal is. It allows the lens to move in all different directions smoothly while giving it support. It's great for wildlife. It's a total waste of time for aeroplanes. I pretty much guarantee if you try to shoot aeroplanes with a tripod and a gimbal, you will knock the tripod over several times. B, you will certainly fall over the tripod. I have experienced all of these, and you don't want to. Handheld, that's the way to go. Airplanes in flight, shoot handheld. Okay, the only other thing that I haven't covered, and I'm going to mention it just briefly, is post-processing. And I'm really only going to touch on this to tell you about two issues that you may come across. First of all, I'm assuming you're shooting in RAW. I hope you're shooting in RAW. If you aren't, you should try it. But anyway, if you're shooting JPEGs, it doesn't matter because you can't do these things anyway. But if you're shooting in RAW, one problem that I commonly have with airplane shots is the sky can look a little flat and washed out. It doesn't always happen, but sometimes it does. And one of the things I like to do in Lightroom is just ever so slightly bump up the blues saturation and drop the luminance of the blues just a little bit. Unless, of course, the plane is blue, then you'd need to use a filter. We talked about all of this in the Lightroom series. Go back and check that out. If you have any questions, or let me know and I'll tell you what I'm talking about. But basically, you can reduce the luminance of the blues so they get a little deeper. You can also increase the saturation just a tad, and you can also put a filter across it, a gradient filter across it, and you can create a little bit of range in the blues. So that's one thing that you might find yourself wanting to do. Another, I tend to slightly add some additional saturation so that my aeroplane really pops. There are a lot of crop dusters around here that I think all belong to the same company, and they're all bright yellow with blue blazes on them, and they look pretty boring out of the camera. But if you just hit the saturation a little bit, it just makes them fantastic. The last thing, and this is something that I suspect you'll see a lot early on, and that is If you're shooting aeroplanes on a beautifully bright, clear day, blue day, it's very easy to get banding in the sky. Banding, I'm not going to get into everything about banding. It's just where your camera is trying to make guesses about what's supposed to go where because there's not enough information. And if the sky is uniformly blue, you'll see these bands either across or around the sky. It's ugly as can be. Probably one of the easiest ways to deal with banding, if you have it in your plane shots, is to reduce the contrast a little bit using the contrast slider. And another trick is to go into the effects menu, which is in the develop module on the right hand side down near the bottom. And one of the options in there is for grain, and adding a little bit of grain, and I mean a little bit, just not enough to really tell that the photograph's grainy, but that will often get rid of most of the banding. Usually I set the grain at 20. I set the size of the grain at about 30, and I set the sharpness of the grain at about 40. So it's 20, 30, 40. If you can remember that, that will take care of a lot of your grain problems. So I think that's everything. When I go out to shoot aeroplanes, it's usually on the spur of the moment. I'll go to the local airport. I'll go, if I'm out of town, I'll go to an airport and just see if there's a place I can camp out and watch planes landing and taking off. But I live in a rural part of the United States, and twice or three times during the year, or maybe it's all year, I don't know, I've never seen them in the winter, a lot of the farmers get crop duster services to come out and spray toxins on the vegetables. I'm not exactly sure what they're spraying, to be honest, probably pesticides of some kind, but it is the most fun I have had with a camera in a long time, because these planes are insane. They're very maneuverable. They're single propeller aeroplanes, and the people that fly them are just daredevils. It's ridiculous. They'll swoop down and fly, 4.5 inches off the ground, spraying the crops, and then at the last possible minute, they'll pull up and go zooming off over the trees, and they'll do it for hours at a time. If you are lucky enough to be in a part of the country like Manhattan, doesn't have a lot of crop spraying going on, I don't think, and Los Angeles, very little, if any. But yeah, if you're out in the country and you hear them, you'll know it's crop dusting, because it sounds like there's planes taking off and landing all around you. It's because they're zooming in and zooming out all the time. Just go find a safe place to pull over, in a field or something, and just observe their pattern. They have a tendency to come and spray a few fields and then move on. So it's kind of like storm chasing. I'll be heading off after the plane and then try to get a little bit ahead of him, park the car, and just sheer luck sometimes will get you some of the most amazing photographs, because these guys will fly feet off the ground, and then there's the smoky stuff, the spray coming out from the plane. That makes for some great photographs. So if you're in the right part of the country for that, then by all means go for it. Well, that's it. That is all the wisdom that I have to impart on the subject of shooting airplanes. I think you will love it if you give it a try. It's very addictive once you get a few nice shots. So good luck with your shooting. If you do take some pictures of airplanes and you wouldn't mind sending me one, please do so, and I'll make sure it gets shown on one of our next videos. I always like to see your photographs and see how it's coming along. So by all means do that. You can go over to alanwallsphotography.com. That's my website. There's a place there that you can leave a message and you can attach a file. And yeah, if you send a picture, I'll show it and we'll talk about it. So until next time, I'll think of something else we can talk about. In the meantime, have a great rest of the week. Take lots of pictures, stay safe, and I will see you soon. Bye.